And white working class boys in almost all areas, whether it be schools, whether it be the workplace, whether it be higher education, and whether it even be the unemployment queue, are discriminated against. Let's talk to Fraser Myers to see why Tory MP Ben Bradley has raised this as an issue. Fraser, very good morning to you. Welcome.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for joining us. I mean, he's right about this, isn't he, Ben Bradley?
He is right about this. It's certainly in education. The problem of white working class boys falling behind has been known for well over a decade. There was a government study that came out showing this in 2008. And in fact, if you go back to 2004, that's when you see black girls starting to overtake white boys in education. And in terms of gender, more girls have been going to university than boys. This is not a recent phenomenon. That's been going on since the 1990s. So, clearly there has been an imbalance, and it's not something that most MPs want to talk about.
No. Instead, we rather get the sort of the media, what can only be described as tidal wave of the woke generation, talking about white privilege, assuming that everybody white has exactly the same experience in life in this country, which is clearly not true.
Well, clearly, I think the problem is that what has happened is that the political class has become obsessed with issues of race and gender, and they've completely ignored the class issue. So, while it is true that, lots of black students and, female students might be falling behind, a lot of the time that is related to their class. Class is the most, important issue in society in many ways. But it's something that the establishment don't want to talk about. People who are born to wealthy parents will grow up to get top jobs, and people with working class parents tend to grow up to get kind of working class jobs. And that, is not really affected by the gender or race of who you are. Class is, the number one issue in society that needs to be dealt with. But, people like certainly the Labour Party are far more interested in tackling race and gender issues.
Well, do you think that it's something to do with the education system that we have in this country? Because it seems to me that we are now in an age where, most of the journalists in sort of top journalistic jobs in this country come from private school educations, in the same way that an awful lot of MPs come from private school educations, an awful lot of civil servants. The sort of elite that we talk about all the time in this country appear to be more and more likely to have come from private school. However, there was a time, and certainly when I was at school, I went to a grammar school, when there were quite a lot of grammar schools, and people from relatively modest backgrounds could get relatively good jobs because the education system that they went through was better.
I think, the kind of period you're talking about, there was, certainly more social mobility, but that was kind of an exceptional period. I don't actually think it has that much to do with the education system. I think the problem is that is actually the economy and the kind of jobs that are being produced. So we saw, for instance, over the past 10, 20 years, particularly the Blair years, there's a huge expansion of higher education. No bad thing, more people going to university. I'm not against that at all. But it turned out that on the other side of getting a degree, there simply weren't the jobs there. Right. So people were getting these degrees that were, in a sense, worthless a lot of the time, and that in some ways made the problem even worse for people who don't have a degree, because suddenly jobs where you never needed a degree before now started demanding a degree. So it's actually, there are, of course, lots of problems with the education system, but I don't think that they can take the full responsibility for this. We could have amazing education, but if the jobs aren't there on the other side of it, then that's the real issue.
Right. And so what you're saying is it a geographical thing as well, that say the bulk of white working class boys are not living maybe in the southeast of England, which is the very best part of the economy in terms of the way it performs, in terms of the way that the highest paid jobs are. So is it likely that we've also now got this kind of geographical divide in the country then?
Absolutely. The geographical divide is absolutely key to this. What has changed in the last few decades is that working class people are living further and further away from where the good jobs are, but also where a lot of investment is going. So it's interesting that if you look at university figures, for instance, so black students at uni, there's around 4% of 18 to 21-year-olds in this country are black. but around 8% of university students are black. And that's not because universities favour them in any way, but it's because they tend to live in, more urban areas where there are better universities. There's more black people in London, and there's lots of good universities in London. Whereas if you live in Sunderland, recently it's just been announced that lots of their humanities departments are going to close. So, geography is making a huge difference here.
And what about the fact that in terms of some of those higher education places, now we're seeing people not going to university on the grounds that they may decide that they don't want to go into that much debt? I mean, that could change things, couldn't it? I mean, I wonder whether by going into the workplace a little bit earlier, a little bit less prepared in terms of an educational route, that you just get in and you learn how to do something in the same way that in newspapers years ago it used to be a trade. People used to go in to university, to newspapers at the age of 16, and they'd work their way up and they'd become reporters, and then they'd become editors, and they were, pillars of the local community. Nowadays, they have to go to university first, and so they're 5 years later getting into the business, and they don't know anything.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of people come out of university not knowing much more than they did when they went in. They learn a lot about
Right.
They learn a lot about a subject, and I don't disparage that. I think education is important, and I would defend useless knowledge to the hilt as well as useful knowledge. But there has been a kind of rise in apprenticeships. I think you're right. People are cottoning on to the fact that it might just be easier to go straight into the workforce, or you have seen even in the media world there are definitely more kind of apprenticeship opportunities for school leavers than there were a few years ago, and I think that's no bad thing.
No, I think that's true. And I think that the opportunity now for the government to do something, I mean, if Ben Bradley's saying this is a taboo subject, it needs to be talked about, he did say that in the House of Commons, he wants to talk about it, the next stage is surely to do something. And we hear from Boris Johnson's offices that they are planning on sort of rewarding the north of England in particular for voting and lending their votes to the Tory party. But what do you think they can do to make life better, if you like, for working class white kids?
Well, I think investment is key. Investment in in education, in infrastructure, in the kind of things that are going to bring jobs and prosperity to those areas. I think they've been so neglected for a long time. I would caution them against worrying too much, obsessing about the whiteness or the maleness of the kind of people falling behind. I think class is the key issue that has to be tackled here.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that you can't really fix that overnight, can you? They have to put things in place to sort of make mobility as good as it used to be, because if grammar schools were one of the reasons why social mobility worked, then surely you have to look at whether it's worth bringing those back, don't you?
I think we should be looking at all different kinds of schools, and there should be lots of experimentation in schools. I think that's why the free school program, which it gets a lot of stick, is actually quite good, because we don't know actually the best way to educate people. We should try different things. We should try. There should be a whole range of options available for parents, and But I think the ideal of the comprehensive school was a very progressive one, but in practice, it didn't raise everyone up. It levelled education down, and that's why it was a bad thing.
Yeah, but it didn't raise everyone up, because you can't raise everyone up in the end. The fact is people are not born equal. Some people will do better than other people at different things. Some people are more academic than others. Some people are more able to work in crafts than others. Some people are more likely to be good plumbers than other people who have got absolutely no idea what to do with their hands. You know what I mean? I mean, it's about giving people different opportunities, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's certainly something that has been neglected, particularly manual crafts and things like that, whereas, other countries haven't neglected that. I mean, people complain about Polish plumbers or whatever, but the reason...
I don't. If it wasn't for the Polish influx of workers, I would never have got my house plastered.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't find anyone else to do it.
Yeah, but the reason that they're so good at it is because, their governments for decades had a high standard, and still do have a really high standard of technical education. It's not just that they're imported and cheaper. It really is to do with how their government has responded to this. Whereas we've kind of abandoned technical education entirely, almost.
Yeah, absolutely right. Fraser, thanks very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. Fraser Myers, columnist at Spiked Online, on the subject matter at hand, which is Ben Bradley MP basically saying something that we all know to be true, which is basically that it's a taboo subject to talk about white working class boys not having the right opportunities. I wouldn't say it's quite as taboo as it used to be, because we are certainly talking about it, and we've talked about it in the past on this show, and we will continue to talk about it. But also, I think, more than talking about it, something needs to be done. And I think, and I don't know whether you would agree with this, but basically the setting up of more grammar schools, I think, would definitely help social mobility. There's a reason why there was more social mobility when we had grammar schools. It was because of grammar schools. The fact that we now don't have them, apart from in a very few select parts of the country, means that actually they are no longer operating as they used to. If we had them in every part of the country, they would go back to raising the social awareness of lots of different social groups, and they would amazingly help people to move upwardly and with more mobility into bigger jobs and better jobs and earning more money. It's as simple as that, really.
First, it's over to Kevin. And, really, the return to the plight of white working class boys, and claims it's a taboo subject for our politicians.
Yes, it is. It's a taboo subject in Westminster, and the white working class boys' poor school results are being serially ignored. That's according to Tory MP Ben Bradley, who says that the failure to address the continuing academic underperformance by underprivileged white lads may be down to modern politicians' obsession with the scourge of white privileged males. The member for Mansfield pointed out that by the age of 5, white boys from disadvantaged backgrounds are 13% behind disadvantaged black boys and are 40% less likely than disadvantaged black boys to go on to higher education.
It's worth acknowledging there was a conscious shift in the 1970s when it was deemed that the way we educated children discriminated against girls, and so there was a sort of wholesale shift to modify the way we conducted our exams and our teaching to actually bring more girls in, and from that moment on, girls have leapfrogged over boys regardless of social class thereafter. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, we may have overcompensated.
That's one of the arguments.
Yeah, let's talk to an expert on the subject, Dr. Tony Sewell. Hello, Tony.
Hi, how you doing?
Nice to talk to you.
We spoke to you before. Is Ben Bradley, the Tory MP, making a valid point that we're ignoring the plight of white working class boys?
And I think you made the point earlier, this notion that there is always a sense white privilege continues to exist anyway with richer boys, and particularly private, especially if you come from a private school. And if you look at that Parliament, Labour and Tory, there's enough, in there to make them feel uncomfortable at night, So I do think I think that is one of the reasons why this hasn't come up. And I think the other thing is to do with race. I mean, it really is to do with the idea that what we're doing here is, and I actually think it's probably unfortunate to sort of name this thing necessarily as white. I would have probably gone after this in terms of, and I think we could make a better case for talking about the geographical areas, the areas in which these young men come from, rather than their ethnicity, because I think that's probably going to be more important.
Well, I'm broadly with you there, Tony. But if you look at children with sort of Asian heritage, I mean they're storming it, including boys and girls. So their colour isn't necessarily a discerning factor, but certainly heritage would seem to have a role to play.
I don't know. I think you've got to be careful here, because if you look at what is the driver here, London has been the key place where the education system of country, including Scotland actually as well, the education of Britain really has been transformed. And if you were to put those results through a sieve and look at it, and you were then to look at Bradford, Manchester, bits of Liverpool, you go to the coastal towns, you do see a significant drop for all groups, and particularly for white boys. So I do think where you live is as important as what colour you are. And I think we've got to look at that, because if you think about it, let me give you one example, and I hate to keep using this, and I don't want to disparage anybody from that area, but Knowsley in Liverpool has the notorious sort of reputation of never sending any kid to a university.
Yeah.
And it's predominantly white, and it's in the suburb of Liverpool. And so and then you go down to your coastal towns of Bognor Regis, Portsmouth, and you go round to the east, Clacton, and you come down to the the East Midlands, and you've got Nottingham and Derbyshire. And I go to these schools. I travel around, and I go in, and they're predominantly white, but they're in a geographic area and a specific area, and I wonder whether it's to do with. And the teachers in those areas, they say, well, no, and this is the specific thing about it. They say, well, nobody goes to university from around here, and it's this notion of round here that is almost the key thing. That almost there's a kind of sense that nobody cares for us around here, And I do think we should be looking at that. I'm not downplaying.
I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, but I do think that, and what's happened is London, I hate to smoke, let's be very specific then about race in London. What's happened in London is become an Asian and black town because white people have left there. I mean, and the only people who are really around are white sort of liberal people who want to stay around Lambeth and Hatton.
There's two types of white person in London. And I've been here for 54 years, Tony, and that is the wealthy people who can afford to live in London, and then my poor white friends who live in council accommodation. And that's that all the people I knew that grew up in private accommodation who are white have all left London because they can't afford to live there anymore.
I agree, and that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that there's no disparaging these people. These people are forced out. Look at the Canary Wharf development, Isle of Dogs, all these places where white working class people used to really kind of be in numbers, big numbers. They're not there anymore. They've gone east, and I think because, as you're right, because of the prices.
So just bring it back to schools, Tony. Just trying to think, is there anything that you would suggest could be done by teachers or by government in terms of how exams are structured or schoolwork is structured to sort of bring boys back in the fold, white working class boys if need be? Because I share many of your concerns about geography and such like, but there's nothing there that I don't think schools aren't going to be able to change that themselves. And I'm just wondering if we can bring it back to what schools might be able to do.
Yeah, well, I do think there is relevance because I was very much involved in that London change, and I don't know why we haven't replicated that in other areas. And what we did in London was simply have a lot of ambition for those young people that they can do well. I do think that the schools and some of the leadership in the schools need to be changed. I'm not mucking around here. I just think that there's just low ambition for those children. I think that some of those teachers and those head teachers look at those young men and they say, the likes of you could never get to Oxford or Cambridge. And I think they buy into this lack of ambition.
Without a doubt.
And that's and this is it. This is because you either have a certain accent or you come from a certain community. Then they don't believe in you. And here's where it gets really kind of scary. Some of the parents buy into it as well. And so you have almost a conspiracy of the school, the parents, all coming together and saying, well, you're not going to get anywhere. What's the point in staying after school to do extra lessons? And the parents don't believe in the child either.
I came from the background. I was the first person in my family to get an O-level, an A-level, the first one to go to university. No one in my family could offer any advice about university or university application forms because they'd never filled one out. And I have to say my school at the time had a very, very low ambition, didn't actually put us forward for university. I applied after I left. And so that's the dark and long forgotten 1980s. But it's really disappointing, Tony, to hear you sort of describing the same thing today.
I do think that the narrative, I think we're going to win this. I do think we should really start. I don't know. My feeling on this is let's make the narrative less about whiteness and more about poor kids from certain areas.